Good evening, everyone. My name is Vita Golod. I'm a Ukrainian sinologist and visiting adjunct instructor at UNC Chapel Hill, where I teach a course on China and conflict resolution, the case study of the Russo-Ukrainian War. I am truly honored that we have gathered here tonight, finally, for this important discussion, which has been made possible by the Carolina Asia Center, the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense. This event is special for several reasons. First, it's now been 3 years and 4 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Regardless of the narratives used to justify the invasion, whether it be NATO expansion, so-called denazification, or the protection of Russian-speaking minorities, nothing can justify the violence, destruction, and attempted erasure of an independent country. Second, when we initially planned this event, we couldn't have anticipated that at this very moment, President Zelensky would be in Washington, D.C., engaged in high-stakes negotiations with President Trump. Given today's drama in the Oval Office, I have no doubt that the discussions are far from over. The world is watching closely, hoping that the United States will uphold its commitment to Ukraine. A mineral deal has now emerged as a new diplomatic tool, one that could in some way facilitate dialogue between the two leaders. Third, on the other side of a big and beautiful ocean, at this very moment, Chinese leader Xi Jinping is meeting with Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu. How should we interpret this? At the same time, President Trump's foreign policy has opened new opportunities for China, especially in Europe. This shift presents strategic challenges and raises questions about Beijing's evolving role in the war. And finally, the most important reason we are here tonight is that we have the privilege of hosting Kaiser Kuo. Kaiser is a host of the Sinica Podcast, the most important, the most popular podcast on current affairs in China. He has been a great friend and supporter of my projects since we first met in New York on my second day in America more than a year ago. Through Sinica, Kaiser has built a valuable platform, bringing together experts with deep first-hand knowledge of China. I highly encourage you to follow this unique and insightful podcast. Tonight, Kaiser will help us unpack the complexities of the current geopolitical landscape, the shifting dynamics in the strategic triangle of Beijing, Moscow, and Washington, and most importantly, whether this new reality brings any hope for peace in Ukraine in the near future. Before I turn the floor over to Kaiser, I want to take a moment to share a message from my brother, who is a commander of a brigade in the Ukrainian army. He asked me to convey this to you. Open quote. The Ukrainian military is very grateful for the support of the American people. We have the same values and we stand for the same democratic principles. Ukraine will never accept life under Putin's regime. Sovereignty is not up for negotiation. With that, I am delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker, Kaiser Kuo, who will lead us in a thought-provoking discussion on the limits of a no-limits partnership, how Washington can work with Beijing on Ukraine. Kaiser, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vita, for that very, very generous introduction and for sharing your brother's remarks. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am really delighted to be speaking here in Chapel Hill, the town that I've called home now for just about 9 years, speaking just a few hundred meters from my home, which is nice. I want to begin by expressing something in solidarity with Vita here, something that is absolutely fundamental, that is, of course, my personal, deep, unwavering sympathy for the people of Ukraine. Their suffering has been immense, their resilience and courage extraordinary. The human toll of this war, the shattered families, the lives lost, the cities reduced to rubble, is incalculable. It is easy from a distance to speak of geopolitics and strategy, but we must never forget that at the heart of the war are human beings who have been forced to endure the truly unimaginable. I can easily imagine that if it were my own country being invaded, my own countrymen dying, I'd have no time for anyone who put forward peace solutions that are, well, anything short of a full withdrawal, a full restoration of 1991, or at least pre-2014 borders, the complete withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian land, including Crimea. I would certainly be devastated by the way the current administration seems so bent on accommodation. They're eager, indeed, to sign away so much of the country's sovereignty. And as those of you who witnessed that shameful Oval Office meeting today, I mean, President Zelensky was subjected to bullying and humiliation by the U.S. president and vice president, who were so willing and so openly willing to side with the aggressor. It was, to me, just among this is, to me, the clearest cut case of aggression we have seen in modern history since the Second World War. To me, this is rare. There is no moral ambiguity here. Putin's war is simply an unjust war. For the last 3 years now, I have argued that while Beijing and Washington approach the conflict from very different angles, they share a fundamental interest in preventing its escalation, in limiting its destabilizing consequences globally, and ultimately in achieving peace. I believed, past tense, that there was room for the United States and China to coordinate, perhaps not directly, but in parallel at least, to encourage diplomacy and incentivize a settlement that preserves meaningful Ukrainian sovereignty while addressing underlying Russian security concerns, not just Russia's, but more importantly, Ukraine's security concerns. I regret to say that I was wrong. Wrong maybe for the right reasons, but nevertheless wrong. The optimism that I once had about alignment or at least parallel interests has clearly been overtaken by events, and it's not been a change of heart on China's side, a deepening of China's commitments to Russia, but instead something altogether unexpected, a complete flip of the United States and its president. Just a few weeks ago, I mean, these things would have been completely unimaginable. As some of you might know, this talk was originally scheduled for last week because of the snowstorm. Strange thing. It was of course rescheduled. School was closed and everything, but the original title of the talk, I mean, it's risky. Look at this thing and think, what was I even thinking? Because while it's transpired, of course, even before Munich, but since the Munich Peace Conference, I've had to rewrite it down several times. You're only listening to the latest version that sort of came out this afternoon. I had well, I won't go through it. Since that last rewrite, I mean, maybe this afternoon, I mean, we had the meeting in Riyadh between Sergey Lavrov and Marco Rubio. We had all these remarks made, whether on Truth Social or off-the-cuff remarks by Donald Trump and those around him, and of course, earlier this week, the bizarre spectacle of the United States voting with Russia on a European declaration and working to make it more amenable to Russia. Voting against it, voting in the company of some of the world's most oppressive and repressive regimes. Even China there abstained. Let's make that very clear. And of course, this doesn't even mention what we saw. I didn't think anything could top that until what I saw this afternoon in the Oval Office. So what I'd like to do this evening is discuss three key developments, the recent shifts in U.S. policy, of course, that's unavoidable, but also China's strategic positioning and the implications for the international order that remains in it anyway. What we witnessed coming out of the White House and out of Munich last week at the Munich Security Conference and in the days since may prove, I think, to be far more than just another temporary strain in transatlantic relations. This may be the worst, I can say with quite a bit of certainty, this is the worst rift in the transatlantic alliance since 1956, Suez crisis. For those of you who are too young to remember that, look it up. It was Britain and France joined with Israel in invasion of Egypt, angering the U.S. Once again now, the very foundations of the post-World War II international order now appear to be cracking. Let me be specific about what we have seen. Trump's announcement in terms of a U.S. peace deal and of this phone call with Vladimir Putin, which he made on February 12th, while not totally unexpected, was undertaken with so little regard for European sensibilities and dropped on Ukraine with so little consultation that it might as well have come straight from the Kremlin. What we've learned since of specific terms that it represents, at best, a frozen war with massive territorial concessions to Russia. It strikes me as a betrayal of allies and principles. President Zelensky, who is, let me remind you, the duly elected president of Ukraine, who Trump, who was, let's also remind you, a tawdry sideshow marker practically for world wrestling, for fake wrestling, an impresario star of equally tawdry reality television. He mocked Zelensky for having been a comedian and only recently described him as a dictator. Then there was, of course, Vice President J.D. Vance's extraordinary speech in Munich 2 days later on February 14th, I think it was a speech in which he gave succor to the far-right AfD, the Alternative for Germany, denounced European efforts to curb hate speech, referring to that, of course, as free speech, right? And declared that Europe's greatest threat was not from Russia, was not from, it was from within. It was these immigrants, right? It was these censorious woke people, right? It was, trans people. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, I don't know if you saw this, but I encourage you all to watch it. He felt compelled to address that speech directly in terms I have simply never heard from a senior German official directed at an American leader. It was a really remarkable speech. If you've not heard it, really, I encourage you to do so. He said, "This is not acceptable. This is not the Europe, not the democracy where I live." When he stated that democracy must be able to defend itself against extremists who try to destroy it, he wasn't just disagreeing with American policy, he was suggesting that America's current leadership poses a threat to European democracy itself. Then came the announcement that European nations would be excluded from peace talks after between Russia and Ukraine in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Those talks actually didn't took place. On European participation, Keith Kellogg, who was President Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, bluntly said in a press interview on European participation, "I think that's not going to happen." And he was right, it didn't happen. The reaction from the European leaders was immediate and was very forceful. If Trump is negotiating with Putin about Europe, then it is impossible to talk about Europe without us, declared Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tashin. The message from Washington delivered in Munich and in the run-up to the conference is both ambiguous and profoundly unambiguous at the same time. It's an interesting ambiguity. It is ambiguous in the sense that it contains both the kind of bullying swagger that we've now come to be, quite used to coming out of this man on the one hand, and what I would describe as sort of rank capitulation for an aggressor on the other, with some, extortion about mineral rights thrown in just for good measure. But it's also unambiguous. These are not gaffes that are being made by inexperienced politicians. No, these are deliberate provocations. Vance and others have played down Russian threats, have pushed hard on NATO allies to pony up more, have called into question Article 5. They've given aid and comfort to a far-right German political party in Munich of all places, as though the historical symbolism of that could be lost on anybody. It couldn't be more on the goddamn nose, right? This brings me to China, and here, as I've said, I must revise some of my previous optimism about U.S. China cooperation on Ukraine. To be sure, the 6-point proposal that China put out in May of last year and that Brazil endorsed was not well received in Kyiv, at least back when it was put out in May. President Zelensky described it then as destructive and not respectful of Ukrainian sovereignty. I don't blame him at all for seeing it in those ways. But by May of 2024, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that had begun earlier it had already, unfortunately, ground to a halt, with many of its objectives still left unachieved. And the war had settled into a terrible, terrible war of attrition that goes on to this day. Once Trump won in November, I think the writing was on the wall. He was certain to push for some kind of a settlement that would result in Ukraine ceding a pretty significant piece of its territory to the aggressor, and it would probably prevent Ukraine from joining NATO at a time in the near future. The Chinese plans overlap with what we've now seen coming out of Washington is actually quite substantial. Indeed, it's probably better for Ukraine and for Europe, in that at least it called for an international peace settlement, peace conference, in which all parties, that is to say, not just Ukraine and Russia, but also the United States, China, Europeans, obviously, would all be participants. This was affirmed actually by Wang Yi, who was China's foreign minister and highest ranking diplomat, in remarks that he made at the Munich Security Conference. You might be thinking, and I don't blame you, that none of this matters now. What does China now have to do with anything that's going to happen in Ukraine? I would caution that there are very important lessons that the US and Europe could have, should have learned from how it understood and how it responded to Beijing's posture and its response to the Russian invasion in February of 2022. It's not too late to get a better sense of how things looked from Beijing and the rationale behind Beijing's moves, as this will continue, I think, to shape how Beijing sees things, will continue to shape how we deal with China in the months and years to come. It's certainly not too late to involve China, especially as, once the war finally ends, the long, difficult, and extremely expensive task of rebuilding Ukraine will begin. That said, what has happened since Trump's inauguration, and especially in the last 2 weeks, will have consequences so much greater for the fate of Ukraine, obviously, than China's position in the war. Its pro-Russian neutrality, as it termed it. I recognize that in terms of actual settlement at this point, China really doesn't matter that much. But let's look at it anyway, because that's what I advertise. That's what I'm here to actually talk about. We now see China positioning itself as a potential alternative partner for Europe at precisely the moment when US-European relations are, as I've said, under unprecedented strain. Since Munich, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has really leaned into this. It's been lauding China-EU relations in the press conferences that it's held. Efforts have been stepped up in the time since, but really, China needs to do nothing. There's that famous meme of this big jawed Chinese man grinning and saying, "Do nothing, win," right? That's pretty appropriate right now. Beijing really rightly senses in this moment the potential to realize its long-held aspiration to kind of bring about, actually bring it about, but it's now going to watch unfold more genuine European strategic autonomy, the ability for Europe to sort of forge its own strategic path apart from the United States. For Europe to actually be in play, as Beijing might see it. Before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, some of you may recall, China had actually made some progress toward this goal. The EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment had already been concluded. German industry was deepening its engagement with China. Several European countries were pursuing increasingly independent China policies. France, for example, under Macron, was very much. The prospect of Europe as a truly independent pole, as it were, in global affairs, in this emerging multipolar order, neither wholly aligned with Washington or with Beijing, seemed at least imaginable, not actually within reach. Then came COVID, European sanctions over Xinjiang, and reciprocal sanctions imposed by China on some European organizations, also over its sanctions on Xinjiang, and of course, the Russian invasion. And with these came a quite dramatic deterioration in the relationship between the European Union and China. In the days immediately following February 24th, 2022, the day of the invasion, any distance, any air, any daylight between Europe and the United States seemed to vanish by the weekend. They closed up all those gaps. The West took up a sanctions regime of unprecedented force, and the transatlantic alliance looked like it was unshakably solid at that point. What's more, the issue of China's alleged support for Moscow's war became a quite persistent obstacle in diplomatic engagement, not only between China and the EU and China and the United States. More importantly, leaked intelligence reports constantly were coming out. Every time there was about to be some major summit between a senior Chinese and senior American diplomat, whether the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his counterpart Jake Shi, or between Wang Yi and Anthony Blinken, there would be some leak about supposed some memo would suddenly appear showing that China was about to supply major weaponry to Russia. Very convenient. I used to say, you know, if I were like trying to get with a woman who's married to some guy, one thing I might do is leave flowers saying "Thank you for last night" on the door, and so, you know, so the set between them. It would probably work. So that was what was happening there. Anyway, it was seemed to me just designed to derail any diplomatic progress. In what I think was a major mistake, the West's approach to China since that time was all sticks and no carrots. There was never any serious effort to offer anything by way of positive inducements to China to maybe step back a little from the line when it came to sanctions. There was no effort whatsoever to try to sort of think its way into China's head, into Beijing's head, to understand how it really saw the situation. I think the approach that we've taken has been built on also a terribly superficial understanding of what China's thinking was, what China's intent was from early February when Putin and Xi very famously met and announced on February 4th at the Chinese Winter Olympics in Beijing, a so-called no limits friendship. So let's go back to that February. China was in the global spotlight and just pulled off these pretty successful games despite the very, very strict COVID policies, zero COVID at the time. They still appear to be working back then, you'll remember. So there were urgent U.S. warnings of an impending Russian invasion. But you'll recall those warnings were being downplayed in European capitals. Those warnings were being downplayed by Volodymyr Zelensky himself. They were certainly not taken all that seriously, even in Beijing. So, what did the choreographed no limits friendship announced on February 4th actually mean? I have my own theory. It's been developed after quite extensive conversations with some of my smarter Beijing interlocutors. I would say that within weeks of that apparent diplomatic coup, which Xi seemed so happy with, Putin's invasion of Ukraine transformed the no limits friendship into a serious strategic liability for China, of which the Beijing leadership itself, all the way up to Xi Jinping, was very keenly aware and very unhappy about. The numerous Chinese analysts and observers of Chinese politics who I've spoken with have convinced me that Xi Jinping and the senior leadership were absolutely blindsided by Putin's decision to launch the full-scale invasion. The evidence for this is quite compelling. I find it very, very telling, and I would like to share something for you. Consider this. If Beijing had known what was coming, would they not have begun making at least preparations to evacuate the tens of thousands of Chinese who were in Ukraine in the path of invasion? Would they not have made that preparation at least? Would they not have started stockpiling resources they knew were going to face Western sanctions? China imports a lot of hydrocarbons and a lot of carbohydrates, right? So oil, natural gas, especially LNG, and of course grain from Russia. Wouldn't they have started stockpiling this stuff? Beijing bet, what I'm saying, on what turned out to be an unsuccessful bluff. They thought that NATO was going to fold. Even more revealing was what happened within China's diplomatic corps after the invasion. Several senior Chinese foreign ministry officials who specialized in Russia relations were quietly demoted. You'll recall the major party congress happened in the fall of 2022. So just a few months after the invasion started, we saw a huge demotion of a lot of the Russian analysts, the same people who had predicted cheerfully that Russia was going to fold and that encouraged the move that Xi made. This wasn't the action of the government that had successfully anticipated and prepared for a major geopolitical crisis. This was damage control. China's response to the invasion has required quite extraordinary diplomatic gymnastics. Beijing has refused to condemn Russia's invasion outright. That much is true. They continue still to say, to use the phrasing that Russia prefers, to call it a special military operation rather than the language I would use, full-scale invasion, war of aggression, what have you. So they still do that. That's absolutely true. But listen carefully to the statements that they do make about territorial integrity and national sovereignty. In the very carefully calibrated language of Chinese diplomacy, these represent, in the Chinese perspective, what are intended as meaningful rebukes of Russia. It's true that these rebukes have had no discernible effect on Russian behavior. It's true also that they were intended as much about Chinese concerns of its own separatist issues or its own issues about Taiwan. But they were also very much meant for the Kremlin to hear. We need them to understand that. Every time they said territorial integrity and national sovereignty, they always put it at the top. They always open with that. It's not boilerplate. It had a specific meaning in diplomatic context. Their constant repetition of it is telling. Chinese diplomats never open their mouths on Ukraine without first talking about China's respect for territorial integrity and national sovereignty. When they emphasize these ideas, when diplomats emphasize these ideas, what they mean to say, even if they are unwilling to directly condemn a strategic partner, is important. It actually tells us something about Beijing's position. It's intended to signal disapproval, to telegraph that Beijing is not, in fact, all in when it comes to Russia. And that is borne out in China's actions as well. China has never recognized the 2014 seizure of Crimea. To this day, they have not recognized, not once. This is not an oversight. This is a deliberate position that aligns, well, first of all, with China's own vital interests regarding Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. When the atrocities in Bucha came to light in the middle of the war, what did the UN ambassador from China say? His name is Zhang Jun. He said that China supports an investigation into war crimes. This is not what you would do for your no limits partner so early into the war. So what then was the whole point of this no limits friendship announcement, right? China's interest on the eve of the invasion was not to see Russia actually carry out on threats and invade, but it absolutely did empathize with Russia, with their anxiety over NATO expansion. Beijing certainly understood and to a large extent quite, accepted Russia's idea of Ukraine as a state that, to a very large extent, they accepted this idea that Russia should have a sphere of influence, that it was part of the sort of Russo sphere. Putin and Xi have actually much in common, the way they understand the designs of the United States and its NATO allies, the fears of so-called color revolution and American liberal hegemonism that dominated so much of Putin's rhetoric since his dramatic 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference. There's that Munich Security Conference again. These were very much taken up by China after 2008. They were exacerbated in China's case by the American doctrine of internet freedom, which they saw as very, very hostile. China found this especially threatening. It's hard for you to imagine what it was like in 2008, 2009, when this idea was so ever present. It was difficult for you to open up in those days to the op-ed pages of any American broadsheet and not see an article that said in no uncertain terms that to bring down political authoritarianism around the world, we need only liberate the internet. There was this idea, and China was very threatened about it. Of course, when the Arab Spring uprisings broke out in 2011, 2012, that was even doubled down. The American doctrine of internet freedom was at the very heart of that. After all, we very happily slapped the name of an American social media product to all of these uprisings. And it started before that with Moldova in 2009, again, which was the first of several Twitter revolutions that we had, of course, in 2009, when Ahmadinejad was, quote unquote, reelected in Iran, and people took to the streets in Tehran. What the American media called that, they called it the YouTube revolution. Tahrir Square was the first of a couple of Facebook revolutions. Everything had an American social media product. But yeah, China was threatened by that in the same way that Russia always felt. They share a sense the West, especially the U.S., is animated by this aggressive, missionary, proselytizing zeal that the triumph of liberal democratic capitalism was foreordained, that it was, ordained by providence. Its ultimate goal in the minds of Chinese and Russian leaders alike was regime change, right? The bottom line is that China shared Russia's opposition to Ukraine joining NATO, but it also believed that Ukraine and its NATO backers had a very weak hand to play. I mean, I'm going to ask you guys to imagine a game of stud poker or Texas Hold'em, whatever poker game you're familiar with. In that game, you have some cards that are dealt face up, and you also have the cards in your hand. In Texas Hold'em, those cards belong to everyone, but in stud poker, you have your own hand, and then you have some open cards that everyone can see. What it looked like to Beijing, after having basically heard in no uncertain terms that no NATO country would put soldiers in Ukraine, and that the very worst they had was they would arm them and that they would impose sanctions, which, let's face it, sanctions look really flaccid. That looked like a terribly weak response. It looked like it had a really weak hand. So if she could, by announcing this friendship, deal them another face-up card that was strong, was all the same suit, a face card that was going to make the Russian hand look even stronger, they were sure, absolutely sure, that NATO would fold, that they would, what it was folding in this context, that meant that NATO would acquiesce to, say, a 10-year moratorium on Ukraine joining NATO. That was the bet. My hypothesis is that they basically were betting that NATO would fold. But what did NATO do instead? What did Ukraine do? They called, right? And that happened to Beijing's great surprise and great consternation. And, as it often does, Beijing assumed that the Americans and Europeans were, they were going to be rational actors. They didn't count on the strength of commitment to values in the Biden administration. I don't think they factored in the idea that another retreat so soon after the pullout from Afghanistan would be untenable, that it would just simply not be something that the American public could stomach. And they didn't count on the emotional elements in it. So I think they badly miscalculated. Now, I have no intention here of assessing the wisdom of the call, that is NATO's decision to call Putin's bluff, to not do anything, to actually allow the attack to go forward. I don't know the answer to whether that was wise or not. But this, from multiple conversations with people in the Chinese strategic class, is what I believe was Beijing's calculus. Like I said, it failed. Beijing has been scrambling, has been improvising. It's been sending mixed messages for 3 years now, until quite suddenly, the whole playing field has been rearranged since Trump took office in January. Now, I understand why many observers concluded that China is the so-called senior partner in this Sino-Russian partnership, but I would actually argue that this prevailing Western view fundamentally misreads the dynamic. Yes, China is orders of magnitude bigger in terms of its economy. Yes, it has a gigantic trade surplus with Russia. Yes, it is. It has except in its nuclear capabilities, it pretty much beats Russia in every other measure. But as former senior U.S. diplomat Susan Thornton, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific, once observed to me, despite all of these things, despite China's much larger economy, it was Russia, through its willingness to be so transgressive, its belligerence, its total unpredictability, that often appeared to be leading China around by the nose. It was effectively the senior partner in this because it was the crazy one in the relationship. And so China was always having to sort of, react to unpredictable Russian initiatives. Since February 2022, that's what it's been doing. It's been asked to maintain this strategic partnership it needs after all those hydrocarbons and all those carbohydrates. And it's been trying to do that without avoiding the worst consequences of its association with Putin's war. There is no love lost between China and Russia. You need to really believe this. I mean, mutual suspicion runs extremely deep between these two. I am tempted to even say that the fundamental national characters of China and Russia are not really compatible, let alone attractive to one another. It's just not the case. Even before the invasion, though, China found itself, with respect to the West, on the outside looking in COVID finger pointing, mounting technology export restrictions, growing concern over Chinese overcapacity, its swelling trade imbalances, continuing criticism of human rights violations, the framing of great power competition in terms of ideologies, autocracy versus democracy, perceived American provocations on Taiwan, American perceptions of Chinese provocations across the Taiwan Strait, and I could go on, South China Sea, and so forth. All of this added up to a sense that China was being frozen out of the so-called rules-based international order. It didn't take a strategic genius to see mounting hostility, after all, in the United States toward China. There is an expression that I think really captures better than anything why China and Russia, despite their mutual dislike, could find themselves in this marriage of convenience. The Chinese is which means huddling together for warmth, huddling together to stay warm. I mean, it's like, I don't particularly like you, but if we don't strip down to our underwear and get cozy together under that little sleeping bag, we will freeze to death. We're on the outside, and we're going to freeze or die. So they huddle together just to stay warm. Look, the costs of this war have been, for China, they pale, of course, compared to the price that's been paid by Ukraine. But they have been severe. They've been quite far-reaching. I've already described how this transatlantic alliance emerged much stronger than at any other point before the Cold War, or since the Cold War. European countries that had been quite carefully balancing between Washington and Beijing suddenly found themselves firmly in the Western camp. Years of really patient Chinese diplomacy exploded overnight. Who would have thought that they would be delivered this gift then, suddenly, by none other than our president, Donald Trump? Look, the economic impact has been really painful. Global supply chains, which were already strained by the pandemic, face new disruptions that were even political in nature. Energy markets, of course, were thrown into total chaos. The grain markets, obviously, we faced famine situations, much of the Sahel and other parts of, especially in East Africa, that were so dependent on Ukrainian shipments. All of this really hit China, you'll recall, at a very vulnerable moment when it was truly trying to struggle to manage its post-COVID economic recovery and to recover from this very destabilizing real estate crisis. For all of the allegations that China was supplying, forbidden dual-use technologies to Russia, the accusations that it had gone so far as to actually supply armaments, there is no evidence. Nobody has yet shown me anything resembling a smoking gun that China has made any sorts of deliveries. Now, there is evidence that Chinese companies, Chinese firms were involved in smuggling of semiconductors, things like that. There's no questioning that. But this was probably done, as far as we can tell, certainly there's no proof that it was otherwise, with neither the knowledge nor consent of the Chinese leadership. They wanted to make a buck. Firms wanted to make a buck. There was a lot of demand. The Russians were paying a premium, and so yeah, there was a consent to smuggle. But China walked up to that line on sanctions. It did not cross. It has not bought more oil, more hydrocarbons than India, for example. India's not bought more. And it has observed the price ceilings that the EU has established. This is, of course, out of fear of secondary sanctions, but I suspect that part of it was also intended to make good on their official position of neutrality in this conflict. So I strongly believe that we have missed opportunities to induce China into behavior that we would have preferred. A clean break with Moscow and a full-throated condemnation might have been, way too much to ask for. That's out of the question. But we could have seen more robust enforcement of sanctions, more explicit warnings about nuclear escalation. We saw warnings about nuclear escalation, and those were meaningful too. We could have seen greater pressure on Russia to engage in genuine negotiations or stronger rhetorical support for Ukrainian sovereignty. China could also have imposed its own restrictions on the sale of dual-use goods that bolster, Russia's military-industrial capacity. It could have curtailed more of the energy purchases in ways that signal disapproval rather than cushioning Moscow, or it could have leveraged its economic influence to extract some meaningful concessions from Putin. Beijing might have also engaged in more visible diplomacy with European nations to demonstrate a commitment to stability or conditioned its support for Russia, compliance with more international norms, making itself a more credible broker rather than a tacit enabler of Russian aggression. Not long after the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine on February 24th, I quipped that China has clearly chosen a side. It's siding with China. We should expect the same kind of pursuit of national self-interest from any country, really. All countries are opportunistic. I do not subscribe to some kind of rational actor theory of international relations, but nor do I think we can assume that China or any other nation is going to be primarily motivated by altruism, by doing the right thing, by adhering to mores that come not necessarily from China, but from the West. So it should surprise nobody that the Chinese leadership is certainly scrambling now to figure out how best to capitalize on what could be a quite substantial transatlantic rift. China's top diplomat. I mentioned it before, Wang Yi, his activities in Munich were quite remarkable. We won't go into details of that, but what are they doing now? Since Munich, he's been basically trotting around, and there's been a substantial diplomatic engagement now. With European countries, so a whole list of European countries. There was a fantastic quote this morning in the South China Morning Post. Let me see if I think I wrote it down somewhere. They said that Chinese diplomats have already begun, quote, moving through the continent with a message. Your best friend has abandoned you. Let's uphold the multilateral order together. 3 years ago, Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered this post-Cold War order. Now, the responses to that invasion, particularly the recent developments we witnessed in Munich, are reshaping the international system in ways we've only just now begun to understand. For Ukraine, this evolving situation presents both risks and opportunities. The risk is clear, being caught in the middle of great power conflicts without sufficient say in the shifting landscape. The possibility of leveraging multiple powers' interests to secure a more stable peace is what they would like. China will have an incredibly important role to play in reconstruction. The IMF puts the cost of reconstruction right now, I think, very conservatively at $400 billion. That's way too conservative. Who pours more concrete, produces more iron, builds more infrastructure than anyone else in the rest of the world combined? China, of course. China has the capability to do this, and really not many other countries in the world have. I think that it would be a bad mistake not to leverage China's capabilities in this regard to really meaningfully take part in reconstruction. For Ukraine, this is all about both risks and opportunities. The risk is clear. Really being caught in great power conflict without much say in your own destiny is not a good place to be. But they could really leverage these multiple power interests to, as I say, secure a more stable peace. The challenge for all of us now is to understand these rapid challenges and to adapt to them, not with wishful thinking about how things used to be, but with clear-eyed recognition of how things are and how they might still become. The moral clarity about Russia's aggression against Ukraine has to remain our North Star for those of us who didn't vote for this man, especially. Even as we navigate an increasingly complicated diplomatic landscape. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd be happy to take for being here, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you guys so much. It was an insightful and fascinating speech. If you don't mind, I'd like to publish Ukrainian translation at the Ukraine-China journal. Would be really good addition. If you have any question, it's also helpful.
I'm especially curious for the people who are here who are Chinese to know whether my interpretation of how China was thinking accords with what you understand. But, that's my question. Please.
I do have my first question. You specifically mentioned the risk of Ukraine, certainly, and you also mentioned the opportunity. I think beyond circumstances, especially what the United States have been doing, what is the opportunity for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to see anything. I mean, it's hard to talk about real opportunity for Ukraine. But I'm an eternal optimist. I think that, well, first of all, the Trump administration will not last forever. Look, let's be realistic here. There's going to have to be a line to have this happen, because essentially there's still money moving to the pipeline right now from as Biden left the earmark still several tens of billions of dollars for Ukraine, and that will still apparently be delivered. So I think abject surrender is not. But I think they have the opportunity, I think, still to have a more decent settlement right now. And part of what they couldn't do is actually reach out to China, which is in a mood to work with Europeans to come up with a settlement. And I think the opportunity right now is to start treating China as a good faith actor in this and getting a better deal that could be brought on by the Chinese working in concert with Germany and other European countries. Oh, yeah, the best.
You touched on there's no love lost between Russia and China.
Yeah.
Plenty of disagreements over Central Asia, the border, the role of North Korea, and otherwise. Do you perceive any of those fissures as rising up in the coming years, or will our mutual distrust of the U.S. keep all those tensions buried?
There's been this phony idea floating around in the Trump administration of a reverse Nixon, right? We've all heard about this right now, or reverse Kissinger. This is actually a lot of the gets credit for the original non-reverse Nixon / Kissinger. It's Nixon. Nixon, in '67, he was already speeding on this. It comes in a different circumstance. There's not going to be a reverse Nixon. Let's make that very clear right now. The original strategic triangle maneuver that was done in 1971 and 72 was it was 2 years after Russia and China had fought on Damansky Island in the Amur River already. There was Mao had excavated underneath all major Chinese cities and built gigantic bomb shelters because he was quite sure that they were going to be nuked by Russia. This was a very different situation than the one we have right now. But that said, when I say there's a loss, there are a huge number of issues that have spoken under the rug on convenience for this right now. If you look at a map of Russia and China and take away the political border and only look at agricultural development, there are sections of the border, we don't imagine like the U.S. Canadian border is just flat, because there are sections of it, especially the northeast, where the border is more east-west than it is north-south. So in exactly the same type of soil, the same type of meteorological conditions to the west of the Chinese border, to the east of the Chinese border, you have density of agricultural settlement that is hundreds of times greater on the Chinese side than on Russia. So Russians are constantly fearful that Chinese will be sort of osmotic grain, that the Chinese will start to seize or lease or whatever land, agricultural land on the Russian side of the border. This has been in years past a gigantic issue, and it still could very well be. This is one of many issues. There's China has been very, very active. It has two major organizations that Russia, or at least some more hawkish Russian strategists, see as mucking around in Russia's backyard. So the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization is basically an organization of countries that were traditionally in the Russian backyard, a lot of the stands, right, and then including countries of South Asia and so on. And then you've got it's called 17+1, which is a group of Eastern European and Central and Eastern European countries plus China, again in Russia's backyard. So there's plenty of kind of kindred for and that's the sort of thing that has the would-be reverse Nixonists salivating, but it's not going to happen.
Thank you very much. My name is Tamar. I'm from Tbilisi, Georgia, which is country of the Black Sea overseas. Well, first of all, I just can't help but to comment about what we have witnessed this afternoon in the Oval Office, and the way that it was the Ukrainian president confronted President Trump in the Oval Office. I think it takes a lot of
courage and resistance and national pride to do so. And I'm sure there are Ukrainians in this hall, and I just want to say very proudly that I'm with you guys, and I'm proud for your president, and I'm sure that you are too. You know, I come from the very small country. Georgia is just 3.54 million population. And we share the same fate with Ukrainians because our country is 20% is occupied by Russians.
Yeah, Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and we have a puppet government currently in place, which is very much supportive of the Russian policy, and it is oppressing day by day Georgian citizens who are very much resisting current repressions in our country. And we also feel the Chinese expansion in our territory as well, because one of the deepest ports in the Black Sea, which was supposed to be built by Americans and British investors, is now currently being built by Chinese investors. And so the Chinese interest in the region is quite growing. This was just a very general comment. I wouldn't go into much detail there, but my question is about the rationale behind the U.S. foreign policy under President Trump. We know that President Trump is a transnational leader, right? And he's carefully calculating his moves, whether internally or externally, his foreign affairs. So what do you think his current policy objectives are? You mentioned the equation, like, and I was quite interested to hear your opinions about U.S. China cooperating sort of to support the peacemaking in Ukraine. But now what we are witnessing is an alignment with Russia, and kind of hypothesis has emerged that this nations, this alignment could be rationally intended in order to weaken China at some point. So do you see any rationale behind this argument, or what else could we say to explain the current state of affairs in the United States?
I really wish I knew. Thank you. I mean, thanks for your comments. And that's, and you know, you have not only that shared experience in 2008 in another Olympic Games held in China. Of course, it was the outbreak. It was also, I think, you have in common a kind of perversion of the narrative, where you know there are a lot of people out there now who seem to believe that Georgia started this war. In very much the same way that you know we now see President Trump trying to insist that Ukraine started this war. It's really bizarre. It's a shameful version. I can't tell what Trump is doing. It's such an absolute chaos there. We don't know who has his ear. We don't know, you know, who the actual, whether there are, you know, real strategists. So you know, we all play this game where we count the hawks in the administration, and we look, oh well, Pence said he's hawkish on China, or this guy's hawkish on China, this guy. And then we look at, oh, on the other hand, he's got, you know, Tulsi Gabbard, and she's it leads us nowhere. I mean, all we can do is surmise. And so I'm not fond of guessing when I'm completely out of my depth. And when it comes to Trump, there's just simply no way for me to even hazard a guess. Being reverse things, hypothesis is one of the sort of more active ones. But I mean, yeah, I think that in that primitive mind of his, you know, that sees things just, you know, he plays checkers and not chess, right? I mean, he maybe sees it in terms that simple. But I don't know. I mean, I really wish I knew. I will. I'm like the rest of us looking for that answer.
One is that I don't know who has Trump's ear, but I know who has his brain. I have it. And this talk played with the foundation. I was going back to what I'd say about March 1st of 2024, or 2022 rather. Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, who is now in World Bank rooms with saw the Russian move as the signature of such a political country that he raised the issue of reparations for Russia before there was massive damage to Ukraine. And that this is another story, but I just wonder about that brittleness of say,
Yeah, I remember that.
Russia.
Yeah, yeah. Let's, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, look. The last thing that I want to do is stand up here and encourage you guys to think about what the state of the Russian economy was prior to this. I mean, we need to really go back to pre-2014, but I think it does help us to go home and look at any measure of human flourishing in the period after the collapse of the Soviet communists in '91. Things fall off the cliff. You have huge decreases in life expectancy, especially male life expectancy, huge surges in alcoholism. You have GDP that just craters. You have several consecutive years of contraction in the Russian economy. To call it brittle is accurate, absolutely. I mean, it's not like China. China, there are 100,000 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. Does anyone even know the name of the political party that Russia operates? No, it's a very thin oligarchic layer. It's basically a kleptocracy. So it is brittle in that sense. It is extremely brittle in that sense. And I think that a case could have been made to buy off the barbarians in rather than fight them at that time. But this is in no way meant to exonerate Putin for what he ended up doing on February 22nd. I wish I mean this, who knows, right? I mean, I'm so tempted to see a simple explanation of Trump as a Russian asset. They have some compromise on him. Maybe the what was the guy's name? The dossier, Steele dossier wasn't entirely finished up. Who knows? But I don't want to speculate on that. It sure looks like he's doing everything that Russia would like him to do. Yeah. I'm not a conspiracy thinker by nature, so I tend not to. I mean, as last resorts, and only in the face of absolutely overwhelming evidence, after Occam's razor is completely dulled, then I but anyway.
So thank you very much, first of all, Mr. Kuo, for your wonderful presentation. So first of all, I'm from China, so and I want to clear out, I don't have any I don't study international policy or anything like that, so it's computer science. But so I'm basically have some knowledge base about any formal politics or anything. So but to respond to your question about some thoughts, so right now in China, there are pretty popular. It's but at least from my family is that we know China somehow has a lot of partnership with Russia, but from the common people's mind, we don't really trust Russia, especially from historical reason of the island of Sakhalin, was back to the old time of the Soviet Union, that they did not return that to China, and for a lot of so issue the Russian expert was retreat back by Soviet Unions, so back to 1960s. So and one part, at least from my family, is that we trust Russia on one of the international politics issues. So that is basically my side, what I from my family side. And my question is that so there's a really popular slogan in China is that for this Ukraine-Russia war, by variant, so that is almost come to the end. This is saying that the profit belongs to the state, belongs to the U.S. The debt belongs to the Europe,
And then the land, even though it's not ended yet in my belongs to Russia, but the honor and there's a quote unquote honor goes to Ukraine. And here's the quote unquote my photo, my injuries, like paying out the war, belongs to Ukraine. So I'm really curious about your thought on towards this.
You have to tell me how you say that in Chinese. That sounds very interesting.
Oh yeah, so in Chinese, so it's like 金钱属于美国，属于美国，然后债务属于欧盟，土地属于俄罗斯，然后荣耀属于乌克兰。
Okay.
So that's like a pretty popular saying right now.
Yeah, that reflects, I think, a pretty common Chinese understanding of the war. I'm not surprised to hear that. Do you hear? I'm curious. Do you hear this sort of ballpark signal kind of explanation very often?
Yeah. It's just sort of so especially like under the trading war from so President Trump's his last presidency.
Yeah.
It's like we always know that China has developed. So and by the way, I'm a big fan of that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give you an easy one. So now you're going to be in China next week.
Yeah, on the 11th, I'll be there. I'll arrive on the 11th. Right?
And so when they call you in and say, this is you will, what advice are you going to give the government when you get?
Yeah, I'm scheduled to meet with Xi Jinping actually right after I arrive on the 12th. Yeah,
ideas, opportunities.
I do. I actually do. I mean, and I'll give this out for free. If anyone has a hotline to him, don't do anything. Sit back. You don't need to do anything right now. I mean, when your enemy is making a mistake, the last thing you should do is try to stop it. I mean, this is let this be all. I mean, we're on the cusp right now of major changes, I think, in China. There's, I think we're going to see a pretty good year economically in China. The numbers at least will reflect it, if not popular sentiment. That'll lag. It always does. Think of the last year of the Biden presidency. The economy was actually good. Again, right? But yeah, I think seeing these meetings with the major tech executives, there's a change underway right now. There's also a reflected confidence that a lot of Chinese people feel right now because of things like this migration of all these refugees out picked up on South. There's this sense that they finally get us. I'm looking at informal public opinion surveys right now of younger people that are happening. There's a change going on in American attitudes toward China too. This is not a good time for China to do anything too aggressive. Just if ever a time to hide your strength, bide your time, and don't stick your head out, which was the watchwords of the Deng Xiaoping era. That would be now. That's a very, very good time to do it now.
In your talk, guys, you said that people are going out from Chinese core and talking, and they guess about Georgia, going to the port and sea. These initiatives that are taking place at the same time, it's really encouraging that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that look, you're not going to the signature initiative in 2013. He announced the Belt and Road. There will be Chinese money and Chinese engineering building projects around the world. I think that finally people are starting to realize that this is not some sinister effort. Look, it's not motivated by sheer altruism. They want to make money. They want to encourage China-centered trade. There's some method to all of this, but at the same time, this is not debt trap diplomacy. A study just came out from Johns Hopkins University that looked at 1,000 different Chinese projects around the world, Belt and Road related projects around the world. Not one of them has China either imposed penalty interest for payments in arrears, seized any kind of assets, or taken any other kind of punitive action for non-payment of loans or anything like that. So I think the debt trap diplomacy myth may finally die a natural death. I don't just wrap it up and look too aggressive. You know, every time China makes grandiose announcements, it tends to antagonize people. Think of, you know, this year is 2025. The thing that kicked all of this off, that started the 301 investigation against China during the first Trump administration, was Made in China 2025. It's this announcement. If they had just simply rolled that into the 5-year plan instead, kept it very quiet, they would have been where they are now, probably even further ahead, which is in a situation where every key industry identified in Project 2025, they basically accomplished. So in advanced engineering and robotics, in gene editing, all the fourth industrial revolution technologies that they wanted to sort of attain mastery, and they haven't done. So they could have done it maybe without so much antagonism. I would caution, to keep all that stuff on the down low.
And sort of interesting, but lots of other questions.
Over there.
Just really broad, and I just wanted to know more about kind of if North Korea's participation in the Russo-Ukrainian war has like had an impact on China. Just I know North Korea and China are theoretically watching balance. Theoretically, because I know that in reality sometimes they don't have great relationships.
Yeah.
There are odds, and I just wonder what the impact was.
I mean, it's weird how little you read about this. If you look at Chinese news, it's almost not reported at all, the fact that there are North Korean troops fighting, but everyone knows it. I mean, it's not actually written about much in the media. And this really reflects the kind of ambiguous relationship that China has with North Korea. The best analogy I can come up with is this. When China found this stray pit bull, and it decided that to raise it in its backyard, and it was really actually useful for scaring away would-be aggressors for a while. But it's a pretty bitey, angry dog. It'll bite you, it'll bite your neighbors, it'll bite anyone who comes around, and it's kind of a cuckoo dog. There are a lot of people who think time to put it out of its misery, but sometimes it's useful to have a big dog who's loyal to you, a really mean one. And you can always sort of say, stay away, I've got this dog. That's the kind of Chinese feeling about having North Korea around. North Korea creates so many difficulties for China. It has bitten a lot of neighbors. It buys this neighbor that China really likes to trade with, called South Korea, bites them all the time. It's more like having an annoying big brother who will, he's not big and really dumb, but violent, and if you get in a fight with a neighborhood bully, you can get your brother, you can stick your brother on him, but that's a great question. Over here.
I was wondering, what would realistically strong relationship between the U.S. and China look like, and would it seem to favor Russia or Ukraine?
Yeah, so a realistically strong relationship with the U.S. is not realistic right now, unfortunately. Look, at best, there are things that I would like to see. I think that we're in the throes of a full-blown moral panic when it comes to China. We feel like it's maybe the one slightly bipartisan issue that we cannot get around. I think that it comes down to evolutionary psychology in some sense. We feel like we are suffering so badly from internal division and in sort of, in-group incompatibility, that in order to refocus that, sometimes we need to create an out-group enemy, right? And that's what we've been doing for 10 years now. I mean, I think it's very, very silly. We picked a terrible fight to, and I think that what a good, healthy relationship looked like was what we had up until around 2012. Let's go even further back. In the decade from 2001 to maybe 2011 was fantastic. I mean, we look at some of the things that were accomplished. There was so much wealth generated for American investors who invested in China. There was such an abundance of consumer goods that made American lives better. Chinese lives improved during that time. There were very few bilateral issues that really boiled the waters in that decade, all the way up until 2009. China bailed out the United States after the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009. There are a lot of things that we really ought to be really grateful for, just as China had so many things to be grateful for the United States during that time of wonderful cooperation. I fantasize about returning to that. And when it comes down to it, it's very simple. We can do a whole lot more by doing a whole lot less. The reason why things were good between China and the United States in that decade was mainly because the United States was so sorely distracted by the two wars after September 11th and then after the invasion of Iraq, that they didn't have time to think about China. China didn't feel like it was in the American crosshairs. It felt no pressure to feel insecure, and it just went about its business of just making things, making money. And it was a really great time for me to be living in China. It was extremely liberal, extremely free of anything that you would describe as oppression. They were better, we were better, everything was groovy, and I love to hear that. All it takes is just for us to not obsess. Honestly, that's thank you.
It's very interesting talk. I have a question about public sentiment when it comes to Chinese diplomacy in Europe. So I know very little about this topic, so it's very interesting to learn more. But anecdotally, I worked in Denmark for 2 years recently in a political science department, where the future civil servants of Denmark are trained, and it was notable how critical those students were.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, like, what tensions might arise for, Chinese diplomats.
Yeah. We ostensibly, the Western countries, mostly democracies, and you would think that popular opinion would actually form elite opinion, but it turns out to be very much the other way around. So it's elite opinion formed by the treaty class and by media, of course. And China did do a lot to help its story along. You look at some of the things like when Lithuania decided that it wanted to open a de facto Taiwan embassy, and I got very upset about that. When a few years earlier than that, Norway decided to give the peace prize in Oslo to a very prominent Chinese dissident. China stopped buying salmon from Norway and created it. There are a lot of things that China has done. China does a lot of these things on a bilateral basis. Doesn't like to work with the EU necessarily. It would rather have relationships with individual EU member countries, because of course it has more bargaining power that way. But that is another source of friction, right? The EU doesn't like that because it has more bargaining power when it's the EU dealing with China and not in individual countries. There are a huge number of issues. There were credible allegations about a very highly connected, very corrupt Chinese company that was operating in the Czech Republic, Czechia, that was buying everything from breweries to football teams and deeply corrupting, trying to basically capture the Czech government in corrupting 2013 or 2015. So there are a lot of reasons for but I think on balance, another gigantic thing is that, American discourse power should not be underestimated. When America decides that China is a gigantic global national security threat, that tends to be repeated in a lot of the media outlets of our neighbors. There's a lot of pressure. I mean, again, Stolberg has made a big deal about China as it's somehow a national security threat to Europe, and it's hard for me to understand how that is. There's nothing like a border. There's nothing remotely like that. I mean, it's not like China is doing conducting war games in the Baltic. It's not. So I don't know. I think it's a lot of these things all taken together have driven that. But again, as we start seeing elite opinion shifting, we will almost certainly also see popular opinion shift.
Thank you for your amazing presentation tonight. That really insightful, especially your interpretation of current China-Russia relationship and Russia as a role of the economy. So I have a question about the future China-Europe relationship, especially under the circumstance where the new German chancellor has just been elected, next the CDU-CSU leader. And it seems like there's more and more ideological conflict between the European Union and China. Europe and want China to change its current authoritarianist government system, but China, I think, due to the lesson it learned from Soviet's glasnost and its tendency to make political and foreign diplomatic decisions based on pure realistic visionary on its own interest, it just seems hard for me that China will make any change in the near future. And also there's more and more competition between China and European companies. So how do you think all these factors will affect the China and
right? All things that you say are definitely there on one side of the scale, but on the other side of the scale is the transatlantic launcher. Is simply the fact that the Trump administration has willfully blown off the transatlantic alliance system, has, frankly, bullied and humiliated European leaders time and time again. We're only a couple of months in. This is just getting started. Countries are interesting that they tend to put aside ideological differences when realpolitik enters the picture. They're very good at doing that. So I think we're going to start seeing that dialing down. The new German chancellor, by the way, has very deep China ties. The Greens, they're not going to form a coalition with the Greens. The Greens, I mean, if you look at Baerbock, she was the big China hawk during the administration under Scholz. Right? That's going to be very different. We don't know what the new German government precisely will look like right now, but it looks like actually the Christian Democratic Union is probably even more apt to be China friendly. Let's also remember things like Germany is being thanked a lot right now, even though the EU tariffs on electric vehicles passed. They know who voted how, and Germany voted against the tariffs. There's I think where Germany goes, the EU follows. In the back.
That's slow.
You get your steps in today.
Thank you for your speech. So I also have a question about the China-Europe relationship. So if, as you say, like China pursue like improved relationship with Europe, do you think that would be do you think Russia would perceive that as a threat? I mean, through all this time, Russia has been stabbing China in the back, like the assault of the Chinese operated mines in Africa by the Wagner Group. And also I've recently read about like the increased penalty or even confiscation of Chinese cargo going through Russia. It appears to me that there's a trade-off for China between like working with Europe or working with Russia. So I mean, like even the Belt and Road goes through Russia and Iran, which is highly influenced by Russia. So do you think there is this trade-off? Yeah, that's probably.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. There's a trade-off. And what China is going to look for is an optimal situation where it enjoys a security relationship with Russia. Its economic relationship with Russia is frankly very secondary. I think that they have, of course, quite a bit of energy dependency, but less and less each year, as renewables make up a growing percentage of the mix, and reliance on Russian gas and oil diminishes. I think that they're going to try to advocate and eat it to it, as it were. They're going to try to have the best of both worlds and not allow the relationship with Russia to deteriorate too badly, even as they encourage more European autonomy, and even as they encourage better trade, commercial ties with Europe. I don't think it's going to enter into any kind of security relationship. I don't think that we're going to start seeing, for example, China taking part in peacekeeping operations in Ukraine. That's almost certainly not going to happen. China will not end up as a security guarantee for Ukraine. I can bet you that. But I think that they will contribute mightily to reconstruction there. That I think will not rankle with Russia quite so badly as anything else that they can do. Okay, you get the last question.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation tonight. But I don't know if you know this or not, but there are some Chinese individuals joining the Russian army as mercenaries, and after that they become kind of like influencers or YouTubers, posting their stories on Chinese social media, such as Bilibili, for those mainly for those targeting for those like Chinese teenagers.
Right.
At first, most of the teenagers or most of the Chinese citizens posted some supportive comments and just support them to join the army to fight for the justice in their hearts. But after like 6 months or 7 months, as the war goes on, most of the comments become really negative and start to call those people Nazi or want them to die, or like calling them nationalists. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you think about this? Does that mean as the war goes on, most of the Chinese citizens, or especially the Chinese teenagers, as Gen Z, like I think we're Gen Z, right? Like,
Yeah,
Gen Z, teenagers start to change their ideas and against the.
Yeah, that's a very, very good observation. I know a lot of these guys. I've watched some of their stuff on Beijing, and it's remarkable how the mood has turned against them. I didn't put that in my talk tonight. I thought it would be a little bit too detailed, but that's certainly one of the data points that I have. And when I've talked to people in China, I hadn't gone back for a long time, but I try to make a point of having conversations, all the time with my friends on WeChat in China, and that's one of the things I'm constantly trying to gauge is the mood, and this is why I've been like kind of a lone voice out there in the policy community here in America, saying, no, you're wrong. China is not all in on this. There's plenty of people who dissent from this. It's not just, these eggheads in like Xinhua think tanks. It's not just the English-speaking educated who oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There are a lot of ordinary people, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's something I should have put in the talk. So thank you for that question, and it's a great one to end on. And thank you all for coming. It was really enjoyable. It's such a great opportunity to speak in my hometown. I get in my car and drive 2 minutes and I'm home.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.